and it looks like we've got a great group of attendees. So thank you everyone for joining us. We're really excited to host this workshop tonight. I hope we're going to be streaming on Facebook soon, but as I said, if not, we'll be sure to share it widely afterward. We are recording the session just separately, so we'll have the video that way to share out. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. So once again, welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer, or Jay Mortensen, and I am a board member with Historic Tacoma. And this is our How to Do Historic Research workshop that we have partnered with the city of Tacoma to host, and also a consulting firm called Northwest Vernacular, who has graciously decided or agreed to join us tonight as our presenter. I want to thank Katie for that. So as a quick intro to kind of why we're doing this workshop and how this all came about, I just want to give a little bit of an introduction to our project, which is actually, first I'll give an introduction to Historic Tacoma. So we are a small nonprofit group focused in the city of Tacoma, whose mission is to preserve historic character of the city. So we work on a variety of different projects. We submit landmark nominations and advocate for buildings across the city. And a project we've recently begun is what we're calling the McKinley History Project. So this is in partnership with the city of Tacoma, and Tacoma Creates is providing funding along with the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, which is the statewide entity, government entity for historic preservation. So our project is focused around the mixed-use center in McKinley, but our goal is to do a historic building inventory, and what that means is we're looking at the buildings in the area, we're doing some research, we're documenting with photos and kind of dates things were built. Some of this kind of research, it's sort of a lower level amount of research than a full landmark nomination would be, but it basically gives us a sense of what is in the neighborhood. And like I said, focused on that business district. And our next workshop next month in April, we'll talk a little bit more about what the mixed use center is and what that means and kind of why we're focusing our project there. So that's just a quick introduction. This workshop is one of the public outreach efforts that we wanted to have to talk about how historic preservation works and what it looks like in the city of Tacoma. So Katie's going to talk about how to do historical research, and then we'll have that workshop next month about the mixed use center and what an inventory is and like what that information is, and go into detail more about that. And then we'll do a workshop in May about what historic landmark status means and kind of how that all works. And then in June or July, depending on how the research project goes for us, we'll be doing kind of a wrap up. This is what the district looks like. These are the interesting things we found, and present that to the public as well. And then I wanted to do one last plug for visiting our project website, because we also have a survey that anyone can fill out. We'd love to have people share interesting stories and memories of the McKinley neighborhood. Like I said, we're focused on that mixed use center, but we'd love to hear anything from the whole neighborhood, because that provides context to how the mixed use center developed and how the history of the neighborhood has developed as a whole. So please visit historictacoma.org/McKinley to see our project page and find a link to the survey, and look around and see a little bit more about the project. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Katie, and if she wants to go ahead and give a little bit more introduction of herself and Northwest Vernacular, please feel free, but she's going to be our expert tonight. And as I mentioned, this is being recorded, so we'll be able to share it out, but also if you want to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom, I will be noting those questions that we can ask Katie, or perhaps I can answer. We also have Lauren, who came with the city with us tonight. If you have any specific questions for the city, we'll try to get those questions answered. So take it away, Katie.
All right, thank you, Jay. Gosh, it's so wonderful to see so many people are participating in this tonight. That's exciting. I've done too many public meetings during the time of COVID where there have been very few people participating. So this is exciting. So as Jay said, I'm Katie Pratt. I'm an architectural historian. My business partner, Spencer, and I own a historic preservation consulting firm, Northwest Vernacular. I lived in Tacoma for several years and even served as the chair and was on the Tacoma Landmarks Preservation Commission. But I currently live up in Kitsap County, where I've been for the last few years. But I work all over Western Washington, including in Tacoma. I work on a range of projects with my consulting firm, but they all are really based on historic research. So I'm going to chat with you about how I go about doing some of the research I do and ways for you to think about how you might want to research your own house. So the first thing you really have to do is establish research questions. What are you hoping to find? Obviously, there's the general idea that you just want to know something about your house, but if you can narrow it down to specific questions, it one helps you know where to do the research, and if you're looking for help, say at the library, they're better able to assist you instead of just doing a free-for-all search. So as a historic preservation consultant, historic house and property research for me is typically oriented towards a specific end result or product. For example, a local landmark nomination or preparing compliance review packages. For you guys, it might just be because you're interested in your house and you want to know more about it. So the end result, may not be a landmark nomination, just that you would like to know more about the place that you call home. So here are some of the questions that I hope to answer in my research, or because those end products that I have to prepare are going to require me to answer those questions. And those main ones are: how old is the property? What architectural style is it? Who lived there? And then who designed or built it? And just a note with that, when we think about the fanciest, highest style houses, there is often an architect associated with it. But most buildings will not necessarily have an architect associated with it. So just be mindful of that, is that there's may not be one. And that's where that question of who lived there really becomes more important, because then we're not focusing as much on the most wealthy people who are able to afford an architect, but we're really getting into what that kind of personal significance is with these properties. So thinking about McKinley, because I picked a house, just did a random Google Street View and picked a house to kind of do some of these searches with you guys to run through it, there's not an architect associated with this house, but that doesn't mean that there's not a story to tell. So just something to keep in mind. So in answering that first question of how old is your house, there are a couple different places you can go to try to figure that out. And these are the main resources that I use in Tacoma. The Pierce County Assessor Parcel Search, which is all property tax records that are within the public record. The Tacoma Pierce County Building Index, which is maintained by the Tacoma Public Library and is online. And then we also have the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps, which they have physical copies in big books on top of file cabinets at the Tacoma Public Library in the main branch in downtown, or the Library of Congress actually has digital copies that are available online. So we'll go through those today. So you can look up any parcel in the county or within Tacoma with the Pierce County Assessor's Parcel Search. And I can say that they have recently redone their webpage, and it is far more user friendly and intuitive. So that's great for all of you versus their previous system. And so this is the house that I picked, 914 East 35th Street. So that's what I'm going to run my searches on. So I'm not spending all this time looking this up. This is what comes up Um, you'll want to search it here. I would always recommend you use less of the address than the full address. So for this one, I would just enter 914 35th, not even east or street, because sometimes if you get too specific with a search, nothing will show up. So this is what popped up when I entered that in, all this. And if we click on building, this tab up here, and scroll down, it's going to say 1905 as the year built. Based on my understanding of historic architecture and Tacoma's history, having seen a photo of this house, which they have here, that sounds really good to me. So I'm gonna start with that as my ballpark, and that seems good. But we're gonna go look at the other sites too to see what they say or how it fits into that. And just as a note, because the assessor is not necessarily guaranteed correct built date, so just use discretion. And it is a great starting point. The next place I go, which honestly is often the first place I go because it sometimes has really amazing information, is the Tacoma Pierce County Buildings Index through the Tacoma Public Library. Librarians there have spent a lot of time compiling this information, and I wish every city had this kind of database. It makes my job a lot easier. It's really easy to point uh, individual property owners or people who just like history to this site to find information. It's really user friendly. And again, it just would be amazing if every community had this as an option for doing research instead of starting from scratch. So if your property is listed within the index, it'll have an estimated date of construction and possibly other references, maybe newspaper references, if the property is mentioned in a book, if they have additional photographs or any photographs of the property, those would be included there. And the newspaper references that they might have, it'll give you the date of the newspaper and which newspaper it's in, and then a page number, which is just incredibly helpful. So this is what it looks like when you pop up. And the search bar up here is where you would be able to type in the address here. I'm going to do East. No, we'll just do 35th to see what pops up. And then I typed it in incorrectly. To see what pops up here. And this is what happens. So you might think, oh, there's a photograph. This is just the standard postcard that they use for all of them, and that no image is available. So we struck out with that on this one, but here we can scroll down. It says circa 1905, which likely they got from the assessor, but again, that really jives with what we've seen about the house. It also has 2 entries from the city directories here, letting us know who the occupants were. There's one from 1908, Ira and Laura Hayes, and then we have one from 1928, Emmett R. and Bertha Hoskins. Why this is really helpful is because when we're doing Polk directory research, which are the phone books, prior to, I believe, 1930, it's not organized by address, it's just alphabetical. So this having a name from 1908 to use as a starting point to go back and forth is incredibly helpful. But we're just focusing on when the property was built. So we're using that 1905 and then writing down this other information so that we can use it in later research. And then the next place I look is the Sanborn fire insurance maps. And so what these maps are
Katie,
is,
I think the
yes.
assessor screen is showing on top of your presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Let's see. Is that showing the presentation again?
There we are. Thank you so much.
Okay, I might have to keep going back and forth on that. My apologies. I practiced this before and it worked fine, but nothing ever goes to plan when you're live, right? So Sanborn fire insurance maps, these are really incredible resources for historic properties because they show the kind of outline of the building, construction materials, and use. So this can be really, really helpful. It doesn't give a definitive date of construction, but what it does do is it helps you narrow it down. So sometimes if the assessor information seems good, but then you go and look on the map and things don't align correctly, that can help. For example, I'm currently working on a survey project out in Hoquiam, and the assessor there indicated that a property was constructed in 1912, but the 1908 Sanborn, sorry, it said it was built in 1908, but then it's not there in the 1912 Sanborn, so something's not right there. So then we can adjust the date of construction. And why knowing when a property is built is important is because it helps us place it within the context of its neighborhood and the city, and also thinking about how it was built, and then helps us track how it fits within that in terms of demographics, who lived there, all of that. So while it can seem like a nitpicky thing, it's actually can be really valuable. So hopefully this works. I'm going to click on the Library of Congress's page. Hopefully everyone can see this. And what you do here is you're going to look up Tacoma Pierce County, because you can see that there's 35,000 collections or items in this collection. So that's a lot to search through. And so then I would order it by oldest first, so we can see that, to organize everything. And then you can see that they have dates, they have maps for Tacoma from 1885 all the way through an update in 1950. And so this one is 1912, so that seems like a good one to look at for the property that we're researching. This is the north end, but then here we have McKinley area, and I have it pulled up already. So you can look at the big picture map and narrow in to where your house is to find which specific page number within the map it is. So I already did that to save us a little bit of time. Or there's an index on one of the last images within the collection that will have it by street. So you'll find the street, and then this house number range will tell you the page that you need to find it on. So this one was on page 261. And this is what the page would look like. So, your regular street grid, and you see how, it's mostly filled in, but there's still some vacant lots. But this is where it's really great. We can look and remember what that house looked like. It had that really interesting porch. Well, here it is. So we can see that that footprint was very much original. And the information that's conveyed to us in this map, utilizing the key that's on that front page, it'll tell you what all the color coding and abbreviations mean. Is it's yellow, so that tells us that it's wood frame construction. If it was pink, that would say it was masonry, or if it was yellow with a pink edging, that would say it was wood frame, but with a brick veneer. It also tells us the D indicates that it's a dwelling, so it's a single family dwelling, and then it's 1.5 stories with this 1-story porch on the front and then on the back, because that's what these dashed lines mean, is that it's not a full height wall. I did have to look up what the CBC means, and that means it's a cement brick chimney. So there's a chimney back here. You can also see that there was a garage that even had its own address. So this is, again, since this is from 1912, what this is doing is letting me know that that 1905 date is, again, feeling really good. And so then that helps to, for further research as to kind of where to start and stop that search. Okay, so hopefully, can you see my screen again? Jay, is that?
Looks good.
That's great. Okay. So the next question is, what style is it? Which is honestly one of the most fun questions to research and look into. And so I put a couple sources up on the screen that are all available at the Tacoma Public Library that you can look at yourself. This one, A Field Guide to American Houses, is the one I use the most. There's an older edition, but then the new edition is really helpful. Because even though I've been looking at houses now for, historic architecture for a dozen years, not every house or property has one style or is a great example of a style. So sometimes it's just a collection of different elements. So having resources where I can see other examples to compare it to, or really get that vocabulary correct and think about um, the time frame when these styles might have been popular is really helpful. Um, and this one is really great. In the front, there's actually a pictorial glossary, which is so fun because it tells you, hey, if you see this element, it might be this style. So if you see a porch with these kind of supports, maybe consider these styles. So that is really helpful for people that really know nothing about architecture to be able to look at that to help you kind of narrow down what style it might be. So in looking at this house, it on the surface appears that it's a Queen Anne. It has um, uh, which works with the time period that it's in. And I say Queen Anne and not Victorian because, which is a word people often use for houses like that. When you think of, the gingerbready houses or those painted ladies in San Francisco, they say Victorian. Well, Victorian is really an era of architecture, and then there are multiple architectural styles that fit within that era. So I guess you could say it's not necessarily incorrect to say that it's Victorian, but we can be more precise. And why not? If you know more, why shouldn't you um, be able to share that? So in looking at this, I think that maybe it's a Queen Anne at first, because Queen Annes are known for their use of mixed materials or types of materials. So here we see there's narrow wood clapboards on the first floor, and then it's hard to see up here, but there's fish scale shingles in the dormer and in this pediment. So we've got that. Queen Annes are also usually asymmetrical, which this is. We don't have that symmetry that we see in other styles. But where we start seeing difference, instead of those kind of turned posts that we would often see on more ornate Queen Annes, we see these kind of squared off pillars. Then we see this pediment element here with this closed gable. And then instead of more ornate detailing here along this kind of cornice line beneath the eaves, it's very squared off and almost classical, which leads me to believe that it is a subtype of Queen Anne and that it's a free classic Queen Anne cottage because of its small scale and these details. And then I was further helped out by looking in this book, and the author had an example that looked very much like that house, and she classified it as Queen Anne free classic. So that just helped me out even further. But that's what's really great about this book. It can really help you narrow it down. I also recommend Carolyn Swope's Classic Houses of Seattle. Even though it's in Seattle, that's very close to Tacoma versus some of these other books are written by people back east. And architecture is regional, or can be. And so the examples that she used, and she was a longtime architectural historian in Tacoma, it's really valuable. And I always reference that book when I'm working in Seattle in particular. So here comes the next question, and is really where I tend to spend the most time in all of my research, and is really what you guys are probably the most interested in as well, which is who lived there. And looking at the building index is helpful, like we mentioned before, those names that we wrote down. And that's gives us information to plug into the city directories, those former phone books. And that's where you get this like long occupancy history, or you can't. Sometimes there's gaps, you might lose someone because they lived there for a short period of time. Or if a house is a rental, you might have a lot of occupancy turnover. So it can sometimes be hard to follow that thread. So places that I go to do this kind of research, the Tacoma Public Library has a really wonderful online digital collection. They have the local history and biography index, an obituary index. So that's really incredible. I'm going to click on that and we'll show you those resources. I have them pulled up already. So these, let me make the screen a little bit smaller. So this, these are all of the different online collections that they have: an image archive, a local history and biography index, even a postcard collection. So So if I think, like, let me look up one of the homeowners that we learned about previously. Let's look up Emmett Hoskins. And I'm just going to search that across all of the um, collections that they have, which you'll see over here that all of these are selected. So the house that he lived at that we were researching popped up, but then we also see that there's an obituary listing for him. The obituary is not digitized, so this is a challenge in that you would have to physically go to the library to look this up, but it has the date of the obituary and the page number that it's on, so that you could then go to the microfilm and go through the reel to find that specific page. And obituaries can just be really great sources of information for people, and giving you, they might be really short or they might be long, or just give you little insights into someone's life, like if they were a member of the Elks Lodge or where they worked for years, or if they were married or had children. So that just can be really valuable information. Another place to go, and I don't have the website pulled up for this, but the Washington State Digital Archives um, has a lot of digital records, and marriage records are ones that are really great to look up. And I say that because oftentimes when we're looking at historic newspapers, women are often not listed by their first name. They might just be Mrs. Hoskins. And so then it can be really hard to know anything about Mrs. Hoskins because we don't even know her name. And so if they're from Washington or were married in Washington, we can go and find that marriage record and find her first name and her maiden name so that we could do more research into the life that she had prior to getting married. And I think that's really valuable to be able to do that. They're not always in there, but for example, I was able to find my great grandparents' marriage license from Lincoln County, which is in Eastern Washington. From where they got married, and then who their witnesses were when they got married. So that stuff's really useful. One, just because it's interesting, but it helps continue the research as well. Another great resource that's available through the Tacoma Public Library is Heritage Quest, which is a database, and it allows us to look at digital copies of the Polk City directories. There are hard copies of those in the library, and sometimes it's just easier to thumb through those. It goes a lot faster, but there's we're not always able to get to the library like right now, or for me, I'm doing research in multiple cities, so it can be helpful to look up things online. So this is what Heritage Quest looks like, since it's taking a while. Where it's at on the Tacoma Northwestern page, there's a right-hand column where it's going to say genealogy e-resources, and you'll click Heritage Quest. You do need to have a library card to access it, and it's just your library card number. But see here, we can see that city directories are here. So we'd be able to look up individual names within that. So we can look it up here. So we could either look up that couple that we had seen in the building index, or we can type in a keyword. So we just want to look up that address at 35th and see what pops up. And again, you want to put Tacoma and make sure you put the county so it focuses in on the correct Tacoma. And we can see what pops up with that. And it should give us other names to do research on. And it does. And we can see there'll be maybe a little preview of what's on the page, or you can actually click on the record itself and flip through the digitized copy. And you'll see here that it's highlighted in yellow to show you who is there. So we see Thekla Morgan and her husband William lived at 914 East 35th in 1949. So that's another name that we weren't as aware of. Let's see. So the other part of Heritage Quest that's really great is the census records. They are only available up to 1940 is the most recent one. But census records are where we start getting a little bit more of that kind of rich information about people, where we might know their age or date of birth, their nationality. So are they a US citizen? Were they born in the US? Did they immigrate? Might say when the year that they immigrated. The different years have different information that they request. It will say if they're married or single, um, what level of school they completed, and then their race, their language, their job. So there's lots of really interesting information that we can find. So the first homeowner that we saw on the building index page were the Hayes family. So we can look up them in the 1910 census because it said that they lived there in 1908. And in the research I did, I know that they still lived there in 1910. So we can look up Ira Hayes in Tacoma and see what pops up. And great, so Ira and Laura Hayes. The nice thing is that they have all this information is, they do text recognition in it. So you have all of this, but some of that text recognition is incorrect because, as you'll see here, these are handwritten census documents. It's not the survey that we fill out online today. So they went door to door. But here we can see, okay, it wasn't just Ira and Laura that lived in the house. They also had 4 daughters, and then Ira's brother Harvey lived with them as well. We can see where they were born, where their parents were born, their occupation. So Ira was a locomotive engineer, and his wife stayed at home with the children, and then his brother Harvey was a laborer for odd jobs. And then the really interesting thing too is over here, we know that he owned the house and that he didn't have, this time he had a mortgage. Yeah, no, he owned it freely. So that's also really interesting because you can see ownership versus rental history. And then these are likely going to be people on the same page that lived in the same neighborhood or on the same block. So you can start to see those patterns of, oh, historically, sometimes people think, well, it's a new thing that our house is being rented, or house is a rental, or our neighborhood has always been owner occupied. That's not necessarily true. And this can really help source that out, because a lot of these houses, you can see even on this block, there's several other rented houses on there. And it's also great because then you can see too how many people were living in a house, because I think our ideas of square footage have changed over time as well. So you can see that there are 7 people living in that 1.5 story house. That's not tiny, but it's also not a gigantic house as well. So let's see, I think that's everything that I had for that. So then these are some other resources to use. In the Tacoma Public Library itself, the Northwest Room has clippings, folders. They have file cabinet after file cabinet of kind of subject organized clippings, which can be really helpful for general research. The Seattle Public Library, if you have a library card, and you can usually get an interlibrary agreement card with Seattle Public Library. They have Genealogy Bank, which has newspapers prior to 1922, I think. And they also have digital copies of the Seattle Times and the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which is a recent one, which is fantastic. Or I use newspapers.com. It is a subscription-based service, but you can get a 7-day free trial. So for example, on the property that I was using as our example today, I was able to try to find a little bit more, and that was how I found out that the Hayes also lived in the house in 1912, because they showed up in a newspaper mention at that address. Another thing is if you know the legal description of your house, which you can get from the assessor, you can do an early newspaper search through newspapers.com to see if you can see when it was the property was originally sold prior to when it would have had an address. So you would know what edition it was in, the block that it's in and a lot. And you could just search by addition and scroll through that. I had that happen. I recently completed a landmark nomination, which went through the process for a house in the Central District, which is one that didn't have a lot of information on it. So I was sort of pulling whatever I could find, and I was able to find when the house was, or the houses around it were construction started on them based on the legal description that I had. So that's just really helpful. Another great website is HistoryLink, just for general information, not for historic house history. But it's a good one. I always recommend it for people who just want to know more about Washington state history, and it's just really accessible. And then here's a bunch of other resources. These are all online digital records, not necessarily specific to a house, but can help with larger research. Here's the link to the Washington State Digital Archives that I mentioned previously, right here. The Washington State Historical Society is great, and they have a research center. You can contact them. And then the University of Washington Digital Collections can be great if you do have an architect designed house. Maybe they have the drawings, or they have drawings by the architect for other properties. So you can see how it fits in with the larger work. And I also recommend the Northwest African American Museum and Wing Luke Museum for the Asian American experience in the Pacific Northwest, because that can be a challenge to research histories that are not just white or wealthy. And so kind of broadening that scope of where you're doing research to find more information can be really helpful. And that is all that I have for my presentation. I'm sure I've been seeing that there's some questions in the chat, so I don't know if Jay wants to moderate that.
I certainly will. Thank you, Katie. That was excellent. I never get tired of Katie's presentations. She's done some for the city and for the library in the past, so I knew she would be great for this workshop as well. So we did have a question kind of earlier on, I think when you were doing the Sanborn or maybe some of the assessor stuff about abbreviations and how people kind of know what they mean. Can they Google it? Are there usually indices on the documents, or does it kind of vary by what resource you're using?
So you can just like Google that, and the Library of Congress does have in their About the Sanborn collection, they do have a description of all of that. But on the map that I was showing, for example, the first page that showed the pulled back view of the area that they had all the maps for did have a key at the top. So you could reference that, and it'll show all the color coding and the abbreviations, because they packed so much information onto those little maps. So they had to use abbreviations. And as I mentioned, I even had to look up on that first page what the CBC stood for, because I didn't remember what it was. So it should be on the map, and if not, you can absolutely go to the Library of Congress Sanborn page, and they outline that stuff.
Great, thank you. And I'm just pulling up the Facebook feed to see if there were any questions there, but it looks like we didn't have any. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the question box. We'll be hanging around for a few more minutes to chat and answer questions. One question asker says, Queen Victoria also passed away in 1901 before the subject house was built, which I thought was an interesting comment because, and I'm sure you'll have a lot more to say about this, but you know, architectural styles don't have exact cutoff dates usually because trends continue, and typically like trends move westward in the United States. And so something that's very fashionable on the East Coast won't necessarily be fashionable on the West Coast out here until years later. So I wonder if you have any additional insight on that.
No, that's a great point, is that, yeah, architectural trends are not necessarily fixed within really firm date ranges, especially because when people are designing houses, it's so personal, right? It's what you like. And so it may not have been as in fashion, or like Jay said, that's a great point about trends traveling westward. I've only worked in the Pacific Northwest. But even when I worked in Oregon versus Washington, because Oregon uh, was a territory first, and so it has older built environment, the dates and style trends are different, even though it's a state just next door to us. So that's why I mentioned this book is really great for architectural trends, but it was written by a woman from Texas, I believe, and so it's very Midwest and East Coast centric. And so that's why Carolyn Swift's book really excellent, because she's talking about how, oh, Italianate, which is another Victorian style that painted ladies in San Francisco, had already sort of died down in popularity in San Francisco before it even made it up to the Pacific Northwest, but we were still building it. So because people brought it up and it was the latest style, but they were still like a decade after the fact. So that is very true. It's very regional.
Yeah, absolutely. And I liked the point you made also in your presentation about combinations of styles, because like you say, especially if someone is, you know, having a house built, it's gonna change with their preferences. And then of course it can also change over time and have different styles incorporated that way as well, which doesn't necessarily make it not historic or not eligible as a landmark. Sometimes people want to go back to the original, but even though a building has changed over time, those changes can be historic in and of themselves. And that's kind of a concept that the historic preservation world is still getting its mind around. It certainly hasn't always been as widely accepted, but I think the preservation world is starting to accept that concept more widely of, even if a building changes, especially if the occupants change or the culture around the neighborhood changes a lot, that those other cultures can be really relevant and interesting too. We've got a bunch of questions. This is awesome. So I do want to move along. So another question was, are these resources that you've shown us this evening also good for commercial buildings, or maybe how does it differ if someone does want to go ahead and research a commercial building?
They're absolutely good for commercial buildings. The Sanborn maps in particular are great for commercial buildings because oftentimes they'll have the use written on them more specifically than just it's a commercial building. They'll say, oh, it was an auto shop or a warehouse or a general store or saloon. So that's really incredible. So the building index still works for commercial buildings, and the city directories actually, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily be looking for an occupant per se. I mean, you would, but the business name would be in the business section, or you could look for that, do that address search in the digital one I showed you, and it might show people like the business owners where they lived, and then providing their commercial address as well. So absolutely, all of these transfer for commercial, religious properties as well.
Yeah, and sometimes in those other directories and photo archives that Katie shared on one of those last slides, actually have a little bit more like photographic information about commercial buildings or larger structures. So those can sometimes be a little bit easier to find additional information about.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, next question. King County conducted comprehensive photographic surveys of their structures in various years in the 30s and 40s. Did Tacoma and Pierce County ever conduct such surveys? I think I know the answer to this one.
I mean, I did know at one point what the answer to this was, but I don't remember. I think that they didn't keep any of their records. So King counties are all have been transferred to the Puget Sound Regional Archives. And so that's where they're maintained. And those did not make it from Tacoma Pierce County to the State Archives Regional Branch. Other counties have them in different repositories throughout the state, but I don't know what happened with Tacoma's.
Yeah, I have not seen a similar comprehensive survey either, other than a lot of the building index photos are from like the 70s and 80s. So I guess that's sort of comparable, but obviously not quite as useful since it wasn't as long ago as if you're looking for obviously the older history. So I know we do have Lauren from the city on, so she can just send me a quick chat if she has a different answer of if there's any photographic survey that she knows of that we're not mentioning. And I can mention that a little bit later if she does have more information. Another question, do you seek out living former owners or residents of a house? And if so, how would you go about approaching former residents to ask them questions? Is that usually part of your research or not so much?
It depends on the project. For just a simple survey, like what's going to get discussed in later workshops, where I'm just doing a visual scan of the neighborhood, then no, I don't contact anyone. It would really only be if my client, whoever that client is, has a connection or wants to be a part of that. Because I want to be really careful that I'm not intruding on people's like private time. I did recently work on a Seattle landmark nomination for an apartment building on Capitol Hill, La Quinta, and it was all spearheaded by the residents. And so that they did a huge public outreach. And so then former residents reached out to me, and I was able to add some of that information into the nomination. So those are the situations that work out really well. But I understand that if you're an individual property owner and you're wanting to research your house, you reaching out to former owners is a little different than me as a consultant trying to connect with people. But I have talked to people in the past. It just usually depends on the type of project.
Makes sense. Makes sense. All right, and Lauren did send a quick note that the city does have some documents in their office, but really not much more than what you would find at the library. So at the Northwest Room in particular. So it sounds like we don't have that 30s, 40s comprehensive survey that that was asked about. All right, next question. When would a home not be considered historic? I have a 1926 house, no architect noted, haven't found any people of note. My main level front rooms, windows are original, but not the rest of the house. So a very interesting question.
It is. I'm a big proponent of, even if your house is maybe not landmark worthy, it doesn't mean that it's not valuable and important and that it can't tell a story. But in terms of thinking about landmarking, whether that's through the Tacoma's process or through the National Register of Historic Places, which is the federal listing of historic sites, buildings, districts, and objects, that's when there's criteria that are established. And that I, as a professional, use that kind of as a rubric when I'm looking at the building, when I'm learning about its history, that I'm then comparing it to those criteria, which are, is it at least 50 years old? And does it have a story to tell, which it doesn't have to be a big grand story. It just needs to have a story to tell. And then does it have the integrity and the ability to convey that story? And integrity is not just that physical, like, oh, everything has to be intact. You're looking at, there's 7 different aspects which the National Park Service defines. And so feeling and association are kind of loosey-goosey ones that where you can make an interesting argument. Materials, that's where you get into like windows and cladding changes, workmanship, design, setting, and location. So if a house hasn't been moved and its neighborhood looks very similar and it just had a few changes, it could be historic. But I would always recommend, if you're interested in pursuing that, talk to the city first, get a thought from them, what their read is on it, and then move it forward. Because it doesn't, you know, some changes don't necessarily mean that it is not landmark eligible.
That's absolutely right. And we kind of touched on this earlier in the question and answer session about changes over time can sometimes be significant as well. So yeah, like I said, I think the preservation world is evolving to not be quite as strict. So even if you know, pieces of your house have changed or there's only some original windows, it really depends kind of on the specific situation, what other, like Katie said, what other aspects are still there, some of the stories of the people, if the use has changed, you know, what those changes resulted in the physical space. So it really, there's no straightforward answer, unfortunately, to a question unless you kind of dig a little deeper and look at all the different aspects. So we've got a request to send out the deck of slides with all the links, which we definitely will do. We don't have, we didn't require pre-registration for this workshop, so we don't have folks' emails, but we definitely will be sending it out with the email list that we have. And then of course we'll post on social media as well. So we'll definitely get those links out to you all so you have those handy and you can click through and start exploring. And then the next question actually is someone suggesting that findagrave.com is another place for information about people who may live in the house. And they also said there may also be biographical information and links to other family members. So I don't know if that's a resource that you use a lot, Katie.
Yes, I occasionally use that one. I forgot about that one. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, that one can be really great. That one is crowdsourced though. So I'm always cautious of, for me in the research that I do, because I have to be able to cite my sources and often have to defend it. I will use that information like, oh, and then backtrack to find where it may be confirmed somewhere else. But that's just me. But it's really great. I see someone else also mentioned Ancestry, which is another great one. But again, there can be crowdsourced information in there, which is wonderful and absolutely great for people who are just looking for those connections and finding those family trees. And I found great stuff that way. For example, doing research on someone and it said that they immigrated in this time and what ship they came on. So then I was then able to go find the listing for the manifest to see that and confirm it. So that kind of stuff is helpful for me. But Ancestry is a great one for just kind of everyday research.
Well, and spoken like a true historian, always getting more points of contact in the historical record it can help confirm all those details. So like Katie said, good place to start, but also good to kind of check a lot of sources to confirm the research you're doing. Or hire someone like Katie to help you do it. All right. What is your recommended resource for acquiring an image of the home nearest to the build date, or at least during the WPA period when many of the photos were taken? And I'm not sure if this is the same person who asked about the King County one, but yeah, so unfortunately we already kind of talked about, we don't have a lot of sort of blanket photos of homes in Tacoma from that time period, but are there any specific sources where you're able to find some house photos more than others, maybe newspapers?
Yeah, the newspaper would be the only one. So another thing about the Tacoma Pierce County Building Index is that if there's a newspaper mention and then in parentheses it says IL, that means there's an illustration. It may not be a photo of the house, but it could be. And so sometimes, when they're talking, when there was a huge construction boom happening, they would have massive lists of permits. And sometimes there might be a house plan or design that then illustrates the list of, 20 properties. So you might get lucky. But unfortunately, Tacoma it has all these great resources with the building index and all of that, but photographic evidence is just really hard to come by. Unfortunately, I wish that I had a better answer.
Yeah, I mean, so often those great historic photos are just hiding in someone's attic or, buried in some other documents. And unfortunately, sometimes the house has changed hands too many times to find that. Speaking of which, for our McKinley project, we do also on our website ask if people have some old photos of McKinley. We'd love to have you send them to us at our info@historictacoma.org email. Again, that's on the project website. So that would be awesome if folks have photos to help us out with that. I have a question about homes or neighborhoods that no longer exist. If someone is interested in doing research on them, I think a lot of these sources would still apply because they obviously are documenting it in the past. Are there any other tips or ideas you have about someone doing that type of research?
Sanborn Maps are really great for that because especially when you look at areas where like freeway construction has happened, You can look at earlier Sanborn Maps to see what used to be there. So that can be really helpful. But it is challenging. You have to know, someone had to write it down for you to be able to find it. And unfortunately, not everyone does that. So that is a challenge.
Absolutely.
It's Lauren, just jumping in for some research tips.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can find a picture of a house by researching the house next to it, or
Yes.
by researching the people or topics related to the house, and then you'll find a picture of that person standing by their house. So you can be a little tricky sometimes.
Yes, great point. That's a good one.
Great tips. Thank you, Lauren. We have a question about Redline Maps. I don't know if you have come across those or used those in your research or know where to find them.
Yes. Can I paste something in the chat? Would that be helpful?
The chat is not functioning, but I believe the Q&A is public. So maybe just put it in as a Q&A, but this can also be another resource we can send out to folks.
Yes. So there is I think it's the University of, it's a university in, it's Richmond, has redlining maps digitized, and it's an incredible resource. So that one's really fun to look at, because you can see the whole country and where the pockets of those are. You can zoom out and zoom in. And then also the University of Washington has a really extensive discussion of redlining, racial covenants. It's related to Seattle, but the discussion of the practices all are transferable in talking about Tacoma's history. So I would, they have a huge section on that, and I often refer to it. So I can include that within the links that we send on, because there is a lot of information about that. And so you can zoom in. The one about the mapping inequality is great because you can zoom in and click on and get the description for the neighborhood and see the boundaries for that, which it's very interesting research and something we don't talk about as much, or haven't, but should be talking about more, because it helps explain patterns in neighborhoods for sure.
Definitely. Another big change that's happening in preservation is that those types of topics are actually being looked at. Certainly there's a long way to go, but that is another thing that is very much still in process. So, all right. Are there any special considerations when researching a building that was both a business and a residence simultaneously? Have you run into that issue, or any particular tips for that, or basically?
Can I just jump in again with the redlining question?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
So Tacoma has an equity index map that maps all the redlining in Tacoma and compares it to equity in current days. You can check that out as well. And we also have the DART map in Tacoma, which will have all of your property data.
Great, thank you. And I see Lauren's been sending me these messages and I haven't had the chat open. So thank you for jumping in.
Thanks,
there,
Lauren.
I really appreciate it. All right, so the other question was a building that was a business and a residence at the same time. Any special tips, or basically just a lot of the same tools?
It's just a lot of the same tools. And you might just be able to see, in doing the research, there might be little notations that indicate that it was also their home. But no, there aren't any special considerations that I can think of.
Okay. Another question about, well, I think is more about photographs. And this is, what's the best way to find documentation to track physical changes over a house over time? And that would basically necessitate having multiple photographs throughout multiple decades. But the Sanborn maps also do show changes in configurations up to the 1950s-ish, is kind of when they stopped being published. And I don't know if any of the, and Lauren is saying Pope directories and union merchant labor organizations have business info for the business properties. I think some assessors websites might have some of that information, but that would be much more recent, not as much kind of over time. So really Sanborns and photographs, I think, would be the best way for that.
Yes, and also looking at what other houses in your neighborhood look like. So if your house has had changes to it and there's one down the street that looks pretty original, that you can kind of clue into, you can date the changes on your house and see when, oh, the type of windows that are put in here, they're not vinyl, they're metal. So, and are they anodized aluminum, so that dark kind of bronzy color, or are they silvery aluminum? So then that tells you, oh, okay, these were probably put in maybe the 40s, but like the 50s or the 60s. So that can help change that. And also looking at trim work, or we'll see this a lot, like porch supports completely knocked out, and then they have the wrought iron that goes down, but it doesn't match the pattern of the house. So you can look for those specific details and start seeing kind of changes within your neighborhood and do a comparison, and that can help you think through when those changes might have happened.
Absolutely. All right, we are a little bit over time. I'm going to, we have a couple more comments. Someone is also suggesting old photo postcards on eBay as a potential spot to find additional photographs. So that's a great resource as well. We have a question about, sorry, just scanning this real quick. We do have several questions about the recording of tonight's workshop and future workshops. So I think I will end with that. But we do have one last question. If an architect is not noted, is there a list of builders pre-World War II who might provide some history about a house that doesn't have an architect specific to it?
I know that there were builders, obviously I can't think of any off the top of my head right now. There were some well-known builders that were operating in the area. I think this is probably where the clippings files at the Northwestern would probably really come in handy to be able to look through that to see where people were building. I know that there are a number of, if we think post-World War II, there were a lot of builders in like the West Slope area. And so there, actually those houses might have photographs too, or you can search in those other categories within the digital collections, and it'll have subjects connected to builders. You can click on that and then see everything else that they've done. So it's kind of like a backdoor way of doing that. I don't know if there's a specific list or not off the top of my head.
You know, that's exactly what I was going to recommend, is that often, at least in Pierce County, you know, the builders will actually still be listed even if there was not an architect. So you can kind of go from there. All right, well, we're gonna wrap up. Thank you so much, Katie, for all of your knowledge and your great presentation. And as I said, there were a few folks in the questions asking about the recording. Yes, we will make it available on both YouTube, and it'll be available through Facebook, both on the City of Tacoma's Facebook and Historic Tacoma's Facebook. So we're just going to be sharing it all over, and both our YouTube accounts as well. We will be having a couple more workshops in April, May, and either June or July. The best way for this particular project is to go to historictacoma.org/McKinley. As soon as we get those links set up, it'll be there. We'll also be posting on Facebook and all of our social media accounts, both the city and Historic Tacoma, because it's a partnership project. So both of us will be posting about it. And then any other workshops in the future, I think the best way would be to just follow us on social media, both accounts. I know the city is working on putting some events together for Preservation Month, which is May. So that'll be announced soon. So there'll be a lot of great ways to participate that way. And we're always looking for ways to engage the public and do outreach and talk about historic buildings and the history of Tacoma. So definitely follow us on social media, and that's how we'll get the word out about future events and fun things that we're doing. So thank you. We got a lot of people in the Q&A saying thank you so much, Katie, for the workshop. So thank you all for attending, and we're going to close out for the evening, and we'll be in touch with those resources on social media so you all can access those. So thanks, everyone.